Welcome, everyone. This is the Liberty Classroom course, History of Economic Thought 1, Classical Economics and the Marginal Revolution. I am your instructor, Robert Murphy. We're now on Lecture 20, Eugen van Bawerk, Part 1. So we're going to be devoting 3 total lectures to Bawerk, and I've been looking forward to this the entire course. Couldn't wait to get to these ones, because Bawerk, not only is he a giant in the pioneering days of the Austrian school, but he was also he was a big part of my dissertation. I don't mean, of course, that he helped me with it and gave me feedback, because he was long since dead. What I mean is that my doctoral dissertation at NYU focused on the capital and interest theory of Bawerk. So it was partly like a history of economic thought dissertation. And so that's why Bawerk has a special place in my heart. He's my favorite economist of all time, right? So we can argue about whether Ludwig von Mises was a better economist, but when you say who's my favorite, I like Bawerk. So having said that, I'm partly letting you guys know this, first of all, just to try to make this more interesting to you, but also I'm going to be biased. I'm going to try to, of course, be fair and not give Bawerk credit where he doesn't deserve it, but given that he's the subject of my dissertation, and what I was arguing in there, among other things, was that the Austrian school has underappreciated what Bawerk did, then you can see, I just want you to be aware of that. That's where I'm coming from. So having said that, what I'm going to do in parts 1 and 2 of this 3-part series on Bawerk is going to be pretty straightforward stuff, just exposition. But in part 3, I'm going to explain Bawerk's treatment in the Austrian tradition at the hands of Frank Fetter and Mises, and then try to argue that actually they got it wrong. All right, I'm not saying that what Fetter and Mises said about interest was wrong. What I'm going to try to show, though, is that their critique of Bawerk missed the mark. Now, having said all that, let me just make sure you get the big picture here. In part 1, I'm going to give you some biographical information and then explain to you Bawerk's approach to the theory of interest and capital. So that's what Bawerk's main contribution to economics was. He is known as one of the pioneers in the modern theory of capital and interest. And in particular, he critiqued all of the previous explanations to date before he offered his own. So in this part 1 lecture, I'm going to summarize 3 of the types of explanations, other theories of interest that people had offered before Bawerk, and his refutation of them. Namely, it's going to be the naive productivity theory, the exploitation theory, and the abstinence theory. And then in part 2, so the next lecture, I'm going to cover what Bawerk's own theory was, right? So he, in his mind, blew up everybody else, said nobody's gotten it right yet, no one solved the problem. Now I, Eugen van Bawerk, will do so, and that's what we're going to cover in part 2. Then in part 3, as I said before, I am going to then say, okay, how has Bawerk's theory fared in the Austrian tradition? And then I'm going to defend it from the criticism that Ludwig von Mises leveled against it. Let me warn you guys, capital and interest theory is difficult. Right? This has been dubbed the black hole of economic theory. But I don't want to scare you off. It's important stuff. And also, if you're thinking, I really just want to kind of know the basics here. I want to know about where wages come from and rent and stuff like that, and why minimum wage laws are bad, and what's the business cycle. I don't think I need to get in the weeds here. Well, let me reassure you, the material I'm going to present and the discussion I'm going to lead you through, it's all with the aim of making you learn solid economic theory. So, for example, you're going to see these 3 faulty theories of interest that we're going to cover in this lecture. The point here isn't simply to say, hey, there were these bad theories of interest, and then this guy Bawerk in the 1880s came along and blew them up. Isn't that interesting? I mean, I think it is interesting, but the point is, it's not merely that it's interesting. It's that when you see these theories, you'll see that some of them are superficially plausible. But then after Bawerk's done, you realize, oh, wait a minute, those people were missing something big. Now that I've gone through that exercise of Bawerk setting up his opponent and then knocking him down, sometimes 3 different ways, right? So I encourage you, if you have time and are interested, to go ahead and read Bawerk. I was going to say in the original, obviously, the English translation, and you'll see just what a master of rhetoric he was, that he would take his opponent, build up the case better than the opponent had himself, right? So Bawerk makes the best case for the exploitation theory that you've ever seen, better than the socialists themselves did, but then he knocks it down. And then he'll say, wait a minute, maybe you think something's wrong or unfair about the way I knocked it down. Let me build it back up again, and I will use a completely independent argument. So even if you didn't like my first critique, let me come at it this way. And then, and you realize, wow, that theory's even worse than I thought before. All right, so he's just a master of that. And by the time we're done with these exercises, especially if you go and read them, either Bawerk's treatment or an intermediate point, if you don't have time to do that, and the syllabus for this lecture, I've given you links to 3 Mises.org articles that I wrote a few years ago on each of these topics. And so there I have digestible quotes from Bawerk, where he's like quoting the original person at times, and then in quotes from Bawerk as he refutes it, and then I just walk you through it. So that's kind of like a compromise. If you don't have time to go read Bawerk in the original, at least you can read my secondhand account, which is going to be more nuanced and have more detail than what I can give you in this particular lecture. But as I say, when all is said and done, you're going to know economics better. This is not merely about capital and interest theory. Okay, so enough of the preliminaries. Let's go ahead and get into it. Eugen von Bawerk, what a fun name. What a handsome man. Look at that. If you're looking at the PowerPoint, there he is. He was so important, such a big deal. They put him on the money. That's the kind of guy he was. 1851 to 1914, and this, of course, is because he was finance minister at one point. So he was born in Vienna, graduated in law from the University of Vienna. He had a teaching post at the University of Innsbruck that began in 1881. He joined the civil service in 1889, and as I said, he was the minister of finance in Austria at various points in his life. And so he was, some have argued that Bawerk was clearly a genius, but his work was interrupted at times because of it. He was working in the government. And so some people have tried to say, well, who knows, maybe he would have been clearer, maybe there would have been less controversy over his theory of interest had he just been an academic his whole life. Who can say? But he was bouncing around in between academia and working for the government. Let me now read to you a quote from Mark Blog on Bawerk's impact. I want to read this. So this is from Blog's Great Economists Before Keynes. So I've quoted from this book before. I want to read this just so you know how a conventional historian of economic thought would assess Bawerk, because he was a big deal. Like, even non-Austrians who don't particularly care for the Austrian school acknowledge Bawerk was a big deal. And so since I love Bawerk so much, I want to read from Blog so you guys can see this isn't merely, me being awed by this guy. So here's Blog. If Menger was the founding father of the Austrian School of Economics, Bawerk was his St. Paul. He did more than anyone to popularize and to publicize the distinctively Austrian approach to economic problems. He had his own axe to grind, however, namely a theory of capital and interest based on the, quote, roundaboutness of capital-intensive production, and it was this theory which soon came to typify Austrian economics to foreign readers. Okay, so in Lecture 2, everybody, you'll know what that means, this roundaboutness stuff, but for now, just bear with me. It aroused furious controversy, even with Menger himself, which Bawerk relished to the hilt, writing more pages in defense of the theory than he had devoted to its original formulation. His remarkable polemical powers were further demonstrated by the close of the Marxian system, which he wrote in 1896, which remains, despite its mistaken belief that Marx wrote the three volumes of Capital in an orderly sequence, one of the most powerful attacks on Marxist economics ever penned. Von Bawerk's reputation in his own lifetime was such as to place him alongside Ricardo and Jevons over even such contemporaries as Marshall. But his appeal declined as the years went by, and his theory of capital and interest, for better or for worse, commands little attention today. And then I won't read the quote, but later Blog explains that by the time Irving Fisher comes along, modern neoclassical economists decided that, Fisher contained, absorbed all the insights that somebody like von Bawerk had given us into a much more workable framework. All right, but like I said, I wanted to read that to you because you saw in the beginning how he was saying that von Bawerk was the one who popularized Menger. All right, so Menger wrote his principles in 1871. That was the foundation of the Austrian school. Von Bawerk read that and said, "Oh, this guy's got it. This is the theory of value. This is modern economic science." And then, but von Bawerk was the one who, in his writings, brought this new approach to the attention of the world more so than Menger himself did. Even though von Bawerk would have admitted that, Menger invented this theory, and I just am elaborating on it. Before I forget, let me say it now. One way I have interpreted what von Bawerk did was to take Menger's subjective value theory and apply it in an intertemporal context, meaning over time, and that's how he solved the interest problem. So it was just, if you will, an application of Menger's insights on value in an intertemporal context. So that's a way I like to think about what von Bawerk did. Okay, so his major works, nowadays, if you want to read von Bawerk's work, you're going to get this big, thick book called Capital and Interest, 3 volumes. But historically, what happened was in 1884, his first, what we now would call the first volume, or volume 1, came out, and that was a history and critique of interest theories to that point. Okay, so there, von Bawerk, and even in there, like you could see he's a master economist, even at that point. Has an amazing command of economic theory that, of course, he got from Menger. But it was a genius piece of work. I mean, he came up with a taxonomy, right? So he had to classify, to label and to categorize all the different explanations of interest that economists had written up to that point, put them all in a little box, as it were, and then he blew them up categorically, right? He said anything falling under this approach is wrong because of right? So he first put them all in their each respective places and then blew them all up systematically. It's an amazing enterprise. Okay, then in 1889, his own positive theory of capital came out. So in this work, von Bawerk says, okay, now let me tell you what the right explanation is for why there's interest in a market economy. And this is where he gets into the whole roundaboutness of capital using, or capital-intensive processes, as Blog described it, and this is where all the controversy comes into play. So we'll talk more about that in the next lecture. And then what would now be considered volume 3, if you get his big book on capital and interest, this is where he responded to his critics. And so that's more for professional economists and historians of economic thought to get into, where he's just arguing back and forth with people who responded to his own positive theory. So it's interesting reading, but it gets pretty technical, and it's really only for specialists unless you just love this stuff. And then I'm just mentioning it just to refresh your memory when we talked about Marx. Remember that von Bawerk also wrote Karl Marx and the Close of His System. That came out in 1896. And that's also why I read you that excerpt from Blog, that people thought at the time that, whoa, this guy von Bawerk destroyed the Marxist system more than anybody else has. And even Marxists to this day, if they want to defend Marx, will take von Bawerk's critique as like the gold standard and say, all right, if you're going to defend Marx, you got to be able to fend off the attack from von Bawerk, because that was the best one. talking about Marx's explanation of market prices and in particular where his interests come from. I'm not talking about the socialist calculation debate. Okay, so let's, for the rest of this lecture, we're going to focus on capital and interest theory. So what is the problem to be explained? And this might sound obvious to you guys, but that's part of the genius of what bawerk did, is he said, wait a minute, before we start surveying what other economists have written about interest, let's first just figure out, what is it that, theoretically, what does the economist have to explain? What is the problem here, the phenomenon that we're seeking to understand? Because if you don't really know what you're trying to solve, then you'd never know if you found the solution or not. So he defined originary interest as the excess return a capitalist typically receives over and above his initial investment when buying factors of production and then selling the output down the road. So some of you, this might be news to you. You might have thought that in a competitive market where everything, the workers and the landowners and the owners of capital goods, if they're all receiving their marginal product, the way you may have learned that they do in a competitive market, you might have thought that, so that means the product price is fully exhausted, right? That if you're making a TV that sells for $100, if everybody's being paid fairly, then all the stuff that went into the TV must get paid $100 total, so that there's no profit left over for the entrepreneur. But that's wrong, right? Because it takes time to combine all those inputs and then make the finished product and sell it for the $100. And so for that to work, some capitalist must have advanced funds up front to pay the workers. So, for example, the workers in the factory who are making TVs, they get paid earlier than when the consumer goes to Best Buy and gives a $100 bill to the cashier for the TV. There's a time lag. And you have to take that into account. And so whoever it was that advanced the money so that the worker could get paid even before the TV came to market, that capitalist has to earn interest on those funds. And so if you think about it in that way, it means the total dollar amount spent on the factors of production, when you add them up, is less than the revenue coming from the product that those things collectively produced. So again, just to repeat that, it's not true that even in a perfectly competitive market, there's no profit, if by profit you mean the sale price being higher than the sum of the input prices. So you may have learned in an economics class that profit gets competed away to zero in a competitive market, and that's fine, but there they mean entrepreneurial profit. They mean the interest is another component, and that is still a gap between, again, the total revenue versus the total expenditures measured in money. So in the Austrian tradition, incidentally, it's typical for them to regard this originary interest, and that's spelled like origin, A-R-Y at the end. So originary interest, Austrians typically view that as being more fundamental than contract or loan interest. Okay, so some economists, if you say, hey, how is interest determined? They'll say, we'll draw a supply and demand curve in the, quote, loanable funds market for people who want to borrow or lend money, and that's how we'll figure out what the equilibrium interest rate is. Why is that hard? And a lot of Austrians following in the tradition of bawerk, including Mises and Rothbard, think that no, really, where the interest rate is determined is in the broad capital goods markets, where the capitalists go and they bid on factors of production, intending to combine them and then sell their products down the line in the future, and they don't pay for the factors they're going to be combined to yield a $100 television set down the road. The capitalists will not advance $100. They'll only advance less than that. And so that gap, that margin, that premium is where the originary interest rate develops. And so Austrians typically think that the contractual loan rate with for explicit loans of money has to equilibrate and because of arbitrage or whatever, be equal to the rate that's set more fundamentally in the capital goods or factor markets. So here, not only read you this quote from bawerk, just so in his own words you can understand what he's setting up here as the problem. Now, experience shows that the particular quota of the total product which falls to the share of capital, that is to say, the gross yield of capital, is normally of greater value than the capital expended in its acquisition. Therefore, in excess of value, a surplus value arises. All right, so he's saying, we just know from everyday experience, looking at the business world, that when a product is sold for revenue, and you can see some of it goes to wages, some of it goes to the landowners, some of it goes to the capitalists, that the amount the capitalists get when all is said and done, when the product is sold to the final consumer, is typically more than what the capitalists had to pump in originally. And so then elsewhere, bawerk says, whence and why does the capitalist receive this endless and effortless flow of wealth? Right? Because if you think of it, if the capitalist can always, or not always, but can typically get paid back more, out of the final product than he put in originally, then he could consume that increment and then repeat the process. So a capitalist who starts out with $1 million in wealth and then invests it wisely and reaps a 10% return over, the course of a year, now has 1.1 million when all is said and done. He could consume $100,000 at that point and then still be left with that $1 million capital intact and and repeat the process. So this capitalist, if the numbers are what I said, could endlessly and effortlessly consume $100,000 a year without working, right? Like if the worker goes out and toils in the factory and earns $100,000 in wages, that makes sense. You understand where that's coming from. The labor's productive. The labor is irksome. People would prefer to have leisure. So it makes sense that, okay, that's why the worker is able to get $100,000 in wages that he goes and buys other commodities with and services. But the capitalist is also able to consume $100,000 worth of stuff year after year. And why? Why is that? That's what we're trying to explain. So now, in the remainder of this lecture, we're going to quickly go through 3 explanations that bawerk had seen in the literature before he entered the scene, and he's going to explain why these 3 explanations are wrong or miss the mark, don't solve the problem as he has conceived it. By the way, I'm only picking 3 here. He classified, he has a lot more theories that he blows up, but these ones are instructive because I liked the way he disposed of them. You learn more economics by the time you're done. Okay, so one of them, and this is the most important in terms of bawerk's relevance to the Austrian school, is what he called the naive productivity theory. And I'm going to stress that adjective, naive, all right? Because what we're going to see in in part 3, of this, is that Frank Fetter and Mises and Rothbard were amazed that, hey, after Rothbard beautifully blows up the productivity theory, ironically, he himself advanced a productivity theory in his own positive theory. Isn't that funny? So I'm stressing right now, I'm pointing out, here bawerk is addressing what he called a naive productivity theory. So he wasn't saying productivity per se could never have anything to do with an explanation. He was just saying these naive theorists are clearly using it incorrectly. They're not solving the problem. Okay, so the naive productivity theory, how does it explain interest? Well, by reference to the productivity of capital. So depending on the writer, the nuances are different, but the basic story here is to say, okay, well, of course a capitalist ends up with more money after you sell the product when they invest in capital goods, because capital is productive, duh. Right? So what's the mystery here? You have $1 million in the beginning of the year. and you go and you invest it in tractors, and then the tractors yield something, and then when all is said and done, when you sell the products that the tractors yielded, you end up with more than $1 million. And they say, why is that a mystery? Tractors are productive. Who doesn't know tractors are productive? Of course you end up with more than you put in the beginning. What's the mystery here? And you say, how can the capitalist consume $100,000 a year? Well, the tractors are making that physically possible. What's the problem, bawerk? All right, so that's what the naive productivity theory says. And bawerk showed, no, this is just totally wrong. It's just missing the mark. So here's bawerk. This is a long quote, but I wanted you to get a sense of how he wrote. So he's responding now to that naive productivity theory. I grant without ado that capital actually possesses the physical productivity ascribed to it. That is to say, that more goods can actually be produced with its help than without. I will also grant that the greater amount of goods produced with the help of capital has higher value than the smaller amount of goods produced without it. But there is not one single feature in the whole set of circumstances to indicate that this greater amount of goods must be worth more than the capital consumed in its production. And that is the feature of the phenomenon of excess value which has to be explained. Okay, so bawerk, what he's doing there is he's saying, yeah, I grant you that capital goods produced factors of production, I grant you that they are physically productive. We can make more stuff with them than without. He said, I will also agree with you that the increase in physical output is more valuable to us, right? So that capital causes there to be more value than there would be without capital. Okay, so now we're even talking value terms. Okay, great. But he's saying this does not explain interest, because what interest means, for there to be a positive interest rate, for capitalists to earn this effortless flow of wealth, it must be that when the capitalists invest their money in capital goods and then use them up in producing output that they sell to consumers, for some reason, the value they get from the consumers, or the value of the goods produced, is higher than the value of the capital goods that get used up in that process, such that the capitalist ends up with more wealth than he started out with, measured in market value. So it doesn't do to talk about tractors being productive. Let me illustrate this now with a simple example to make sure you get the point. So imagine we've got this tractor, and that when you have the tractor, using it on this plot of farmland, you can extract $1,000 more per year in crops than without the tractor. And also, let's suppose that a brand new tractor will last 10 years, and then at the end of the 10 years, it's completely useless. You don't even get scrap metal prices for it. It's just you got to throw it out, and it's got zero value. All right? So how would bawerk handle this? He would say, yeah, the tractor is productive. I'll grant you that. And because of the productivity of the tractor, what does that mean in terms of market prices? That's why a farmer would pay the owner of this tractor $1,000 a year to rent it. So the marginal productivity of the tractor, the fact that you can harvest more crops with it than without it, explains its rental price. In this case, $1,000 a year. So if you own that tractor up front in the beginning when it's brand new, you know you're now going to enjoy an annual flow of $1,000 per year in rental payments. But bawerk is pointing out that fact by itself, or those facts by themselves, doesn't let us know that there's going to be a positive interest rate. Because what if that initial purchase price of the tractor is exactly $10,000? What if I'm a capitalist and I need to, if I want to buy this new tractor, what if the purchase price is $10,000? So I give $10,000, I get this brand new tractor. At the end of year one, I get $1,000 payment. At the end of year two, I get a $2,000, or the second payment of $1,000, and so on. So that by year 10, I've gotten a total of $10,000 in rental payments, and now the tractor's worthless. So when all is said and done, I pumped in $10,000 up front, and by the time the tractor completely physically depreciated and is useless, I reaped $10,000 for a grand interest return of 0%. And that story I just told you fully incorporates the fact that the tractor is physically productive and that more crops are more valuable than less crops. And yet, that story I just told is consistent with the interest rate being 0. So Bawerk's point is the productivity of capital goods, if what you mean is simply you can produce more with capital goods than without, that clearly is not sufficient to explain the existence of interest. Okay, now let's talk about 2 other possible theories. The next one is the exploitation theory. So this is the theory that was advanced by the socialist writers. Remember, Karl Marx was not the first socialist. And Bawerk called this the exploitation theory. He said we could just call this the socialist theory, but he thought that would be more of an incidental term. He thought a more accurate term for this theory of interest would be the exploitation theory. And he focused on the exposition given by the socialist Rod Burtis, because Bawerk thought that was a pretty good exposition in terms of who made the theory or who presented it in the best possible light. So somebody like Rod Burtis thinks that value is derived from labor, right? The socialists had a labor theory of value. And remember, the socialists didn't invent that. They got it from the British classical economists. So if you think all value ultimately is derived from labor, and yet you see these capitalists getting to consume when they personally haven't lifted a finger. The capitalists aren't expending labor. It's the workers doing that. So from the let's not say the Marxists, from the exploitation theory point of view, the existence of interest is due to power relationships and the fact that the capitalist class is able to get the workers to consume less than the full value of their product. So the workers are the ones ultimately making all the stuff, and yet the workers don't consume 100% of GDP, to use modern terminology. The capitalists somehow are siphoning some portion of that, skimming some off the top, and they're consuming even though they don't work. So that's the exploitation theory of interest. It's based on the fact that the workers are able to produce more than it takes to physically sustain them. And so because of their poor bargaining position, they get paid wages that are less than the full value of the product they're making. And it's the capitalist employers who then keep the difference. All right, so first of all, Bawerk blows up the labor theory of value. He just he has several arguments to show Rod Burtis and other socialists are simply wrong by holding the labor theory of value. It's not correct. So, one problem with it is labor is not the only scarce input. And so when you understand why workers end up being paid for their labor contribution towards a product, by the same token, a landowner is going to get paid for that, for the contribution of the productive services of the land, or somebody who owns a coal mine or something like that. And that stuff is not ultimately reduced to the labor input. So the labor theory is just wrong in general. So clearly, a theory of interest that's derived from the labor theory of value is also going to be wrong. But Bawerk says, you know what? Let's isolate. There's something even more wrong about the exploitation theory. So he said, even if we put aside the fact that it's based on the labor theory of value, let's consider a productive process where labor is the only scarce input, so that there's a sense in which the finished product is due entirely to the production of the workers. And Bawerk says, even in this case, Rod Burtis is still wrong, and it's instructive to see why. So you might be surprised by this move, but Bawerk admits, he says, yeah, I fully agree with the socialists. The workers should get paid wages equal to the full value of their product. So you might think, well, wait a minute. How then can the capitalist consume $100,000 a year without manually working if you just said the workers consume the full value of their product. And here's the genius of bawerk, though. He says, okay, what does that mean? If the worker is working on a project that won't yield its finished good until 5 years from now, so the workers are working on something that's going to sell for $100 in 5 years, and so the worker today working on that, he should be paid $100, right? But when? bawerk says if you're going to pay him the full $100, he has to wait 5 years to get it. That, in other words, the worker should be paid the full future value in the future. Or, if the worker wants, he can be paid right now, but surely what he should get right now is equal to the current market value of the thing he produced right now. And so if the worker only made a half of a TV and more things need to be done to it so that 5 years from now it can be sold as a full TV, the worker is not going to be paid right now as if what he produced was a half of a current TV, because he didn't. He produced half of a future TV. And so if people think present goods are more valuable than future goods, well, then it's not the same thing. And bawerk gives a different way of illustrating it. He says, okay, if you're not sure, think of it this way. The workers, when they get paid wages now that somebody like Redbertus is going to say is not equal to the full value of their contribution, they're allowed to go invest that at interest. Because what's really happening here is the workers are being paid a discounted wage. The workers being paid today for something that really isn't going to bring revenue into the employer until years in the future, they're being paid that future wage, as it were, or their contribution at the time of sale, but it's discounted at the prevailing market rate of interest to today's dollars. And so bawerk is saying if that strikes you as unfair, the laborers can go take their paychecks and go invest them and earn interest returns, and then you would find at the point at which the product they worked on is actually sold for revenue to the employer, the wages they invested that were rolling over to interest would have grown to be equal to the, quote, full value of the product of their labor. So bawerk is saying there's no question that the workers are getting paid the full value. What's happening, though, typically is the worker wants to get paid in advance. The worker wants to get paid now for work on a project that won't actually be sold for revenue until the future. And so present dollars are worth more than future dollars, and that's why if you just naively sum up the total dollar expenditures on a product and then compare that with the number of dollars of revenue that it fetches down the road, it's going to look like there's a discrepancy. Okay. Lastly, the abstinence theory. So this one's really clever. I'm going to try to do it justice in this quick summary I'm giving you guys here, but I really encourage you to read this. You don't have to go to bawerk and read it, but read my discussion of this at Mises.org that I'm linking in the syllabus, because this is pretty clever, and this one in particular really gets you to understand economic theory better if you think through it. And also, initially, it looks like it's a pretty decent approach. It seems like it's right, but it's not. There's a subtle but serious flaw with this theory. So, the abstinence theory was actually advanced by Nassau Sr., who was a very respected economist in the history of economic thought. And I say here in the PowerPoint, it was close but still wrong, meaning Senior knew that the time element had something to do with interest, right? So whereas like the exploitation theory in bawerk's view, I mean, that was just totally wrong. It was, first of all, based on a faulty labor theory of value, and it was totally wrong by viewing it as the capitalists somehow underpaying this particular class of workers and not at all getting the fact that work done today for a product that won't come to market in years in the future, and realizing that the time element is crucial there, right? So the exploitation theory is hopeless, whereas the abstinence theory in bawerk's framework is very close to the real explanation, but it is still wrong and seriously wrong. And let me also say, some historians of economic thought believe that bawerk was too harsh with the people that were very close to his own explanation, but I don't think he was. And so we'll see here with this theory, for example, it's not just quibbling over words. Senior's theory is totally wrong, but at first it sounds like it's saying the same thing as like bawerk will say, but it's not. All right, let me now get into it after I've given you that exhaustive list of caveats. Okay, so what did Nassau Senior say was the explanation for the existence of interest? Why was it that typically, if you added up the expenditures on the wages and rents and so on, why was it that you could then sell the product for a bigger number, such that the capitalists who invested in the project up front were able to get more dollars out than they put into it? Why is that? Nassau Senior said, because in addition to the labor and other conventional inputs that economists would have accounted for, a lengthy production process requires the input of a different type of factor, namely the abstinence on the part of the investors. And this requires payment just like wages. So remember, let's think about it in terms of labor. It's clear why the product that sells for $100, some of that, whatever, $80 worth goes as wages to the workers who made it. And why is that? Well, because labor is a factor. It's a scarce factor of production. It's productive. You can make more things with labor than without. So the labor is physically productive, and it's irksome, right? There's disutility of labor. So the workers are going to need to be paid in order to convince them to contribute to this project. They're not just going to perform the toil for free. And so that totally makes sense. Then why is it that in equilibrium, a lot of the product price is absorbed by payment of wages? Okay, fine. And so Nassau Senior said there's a very similar thing going on with interest, that you need abstinence on the part of the investors, the capitalists, in order to make this project possible. If they're not willing to save and invest, this isn't going to happen. And it's irksome, right? They would rather not have to wait for the product to come to market. So the fact that they're willing to do that, they need to be compensated, and that's what interest is. It's the compensation to this scarce productive factor that we'll call abstinence. So that superficially, that sounds like it's pretty reasonable. And if you know where this is going, and you know that the Austrian theory is going to stress the role of time preference, then you might think, isn't this basically the same thing, just with a different label? And no, it's actually not. So the problem here is that Senior's abstinence theory, he was trying to, yes, he knew the time element was crucial to solving the problem, but he was trying to plug it in the wrong spot. He was trying to make it look like waiting was this other factor, abstinence was this other factor that was on the cost side. Right, so just like, oh yeah, we got to pay for the wages to the workers. Now, oh yeah, we got to pay for the abstinence on the investors in order to make this thing work. That's where he was trying to plug the time element in, and that's the wrong spot. Where the time element comes in is on the benefit side. That other things equal, a product that's not going to be available or a service that's not going to be available until the future, that makes it less valuable in our eyes today. And so that's where the time element comes into play. It's on the benefit side, not on the cost side. Okay, so that's a statement of the problem in terms of theory, but you might say, yeah, that's kind of hard for me. So bawerk gives this wonderful example that beautifully illustrates this. So again, I'm going to encourage you to go and read my essay on this to get it fully. But let me try to very quickly here as we wrap up this lecture, explain it to you and give you the basics. So bawerk says, all right, suppose there's a person and he's thinking about devoting a day of labor to two possible projects. And one project is a very short-lived one that he can go and just try to catch fish, and at the end of the day, he'll have 10 fish to show for it, if that's what he decides to do. Or he can decide to spend the day planting apple seeds and, tilling the land or whatever, getting it ready and picking a spot where it'd be great for trees to grow. And that's a very long-term process. If he does that, he devotes his day labor to planting the apple seed. 10 years from now, he's going to have 100 apples to show for it. All right, so again, the choice before him is to say, I have a day of labor that I'm willing to devote to something. I can either have 10 fish available at the end of the day, or I can have 100 apples available in 10 years. And so now, how do we talk about the market prices involved with these things? Well, in equilibrium, if there's no surprises and so on, it's got to be the case that the market value of 10 fish is equal to the market value of a day's labor. Right? So if let's make it easy, let's say the guy works 10 hours in a day. So if the fish cost $1 a piece, then the wages are $1 an hour. And so the wages have to be such that you work a day, you get paid enough that you can go buy 10 fish. That has to be the case because, again, it takes a day's labor to make 10 fish. Okay. But 100 apples is going to have a higher market value than 10 fish. Or another way of looking at it is, if a capitalist were to pay $10 to a worker today so that he would go ahead and plant the apple seeds and do everything, and then we just let nature take its course, and then 10 years later that work ripens into the fruition of 100 apples, and now the capitalist is the owner of that and sells the 100 apples, he's going to have more than $10 because he will have earned an interest return. And so bawerk is saying Nassau Senior wants to explain that by saying, in addition to that day of labor up front, there was an additional cost, namely that the capitalist had to wait 10 years. And so that explains why he's then able to sell the 100 apples for more than $10 or for more than 10 fish, is because in addition to the worker's labor, there was also his own abstinence that had to get put into the production of those things. So how does bawerk show that can't be right, that there's a fallacy there, that's double counting? He says, suppose after that day of labor, a storm comes and wipes out the work that had been done. So now, no tree is going to grow. What would we say now? Well, what's the loss? What was the cost there? Well, it was clearly just the day's labor. The worker worked all day, and now there's nothing to show for it. So what did he lose out on? It was a day of labor. All right. But he says beyond that, what if instead he just lasts forever? Well, then clearly it is an infinite expenditure. Okay. And so he's saying, if you thought the abstinence is partly why the 100 apples 10 years in the future are worth more than the 10 fish, you would have to think now when a storm comes and wipes out the work that the worker did with the apple tree, that now the loss is infinite, because now that capital, not only did you have to input the day of labor, you're going to have to wait eternity for that product, which is never going to come. And bawerk says, clearly that's not true. Clearly the cost is that day labor, right? And so thinking through the logic of that, you can see, okay, so then if the storm doesn't come, how do we figure out what's going on? The reason those apples that are going to accrue in 10 years, at that point, they're 100 apples 10 years from now. And so they have a lower benefit to us, value to us right now than 100 apples immediately available. And that's the way to understand why is it that when the capitalist waits 10 years and now has 100 present apples, they have a higher market value than those 10 fish. Put it another way, if the same day's labor today can give me either 10 fish now or 100 apples to be delivered in 10 years, then that means the market value of those things right now has to be equal. And so if now you see 100 apples in 10 years is the same market value as 10 fish now, well, then when those apples mature into being present apples, clearly 100 present apples right now are going to have a higher market value than 10 fish right now, because an apple right now is more valuable than an apple to be delivered in 10 years. All right, so I hope you were able to grab that. It might be difficult. Again, let me just say in summary for this lecture, if some of this stuff is beyond your grasp, don't worry. This is really complicated stuff, but it's also important, and I wanted to stress it so you could understand the beauty of what bawerk has done in these expositions and just the economic theory that you can derive from it over and above an understanding of capital and interest. All right, we will come back to this in the next lecture.